I'm Sarah, 52, and this is the story of how my late husband's workshop became the center of an inheritance drama that nobody saw coming. Tom was everything to me: a skilled remodeler, a man who believed in second chances, and someone who could never say no to helping others. Sometimes that last part got him into trouble. The workshop was his sanctuary. You know those places that just feel alive with memories? Every corner had a story. The workbench he built during our first year of marriage, the wall of perfectly organized tools that took him 20 years to collect, even the old radio that played nothing but classic rock while he worked. The smell of sawdust and machine oil was as familiar to me as my morning coffee. Tom had built his remodeling business from scratch, earning a reputation as the guy who could fix anything. He was the person everyone called when they needed help, and his client list grew through nothing but word of mouth. Local families trusted him with their homes, which meant everything to him. A man's reputation is built on trust. He'd always say, usually while carefully cleaning a borrowed tool before returning it. That's where Kiki comes in. She was the adult daughter of my best friend Ami. We're talking 42 years of friendship here. Ami and I had been through everything together: marriages, births, deaths, you name it. When Kiki started struggling to find steady work, it was natural for Tom to offer her a chance as a helper on his bigger projects. I still remember him saying, "Everyone deserves a shot at turning their life around." At first, it seemed like a perfect arrangement. Kiki learned the basics quickly enough, and Tom was patient with teaching her. The problems started small. So small we barely noticed them at first. She'd borrow tools for her own side projects, which wasn't unusual in our circle. A portable CD player here, a pair of channel locks there. Tom kept meticulous care of his tools, always cleaning them before lending them out, making sure all the parts were there, checking that everything was in working order, but every time Kiki borrowed something, it came back wrong. The CD player returned 3 months later with a cracked case and missing buttons. The channel locks came back rusted, with the grips mysteriously gone. Each time, there was an excuse. It must have been like that, or I think it was already damaged, or my personal favorite. I don't remember it having all those parts when I borrowed it. Tom tried to be understanding, but I could see it wearing on him. These weren't just tools to him. They were his livelihood. The breaking point should have been the Graco cart paint sprayer. It was a beautiful piece of equipment. Barely 4 months old, cost us $200. Tom had saved specifically for it, researching for weeks to make sure he got exactly the right model. Kiki borrowed it for what was supposed to be a weekend project. 3 weeks later, after countless unanswered calls and texts, she returned it looking like it had been through a war zone. The nozzle was completely destroyed, the hose had multiple kinks and tears, and the motor made a sound that I can only describe as mechanical death. The warranty was voided because of obvious misuse. Tom was devastated. Not just because of the money, but because of the disrespect it showed. "I just don't understand," he said that night, sitting in his workshop looking at the ruined sprayer. "I show people how to use everything properly. I make sure they understand what they're borrowing. Why would someone treat tools this way?" The sprayer was just one item in a growing list. Over 2 years, Kiki had managed to destroy or damage a winch and come along, returned with a frayed cable, a table saw, missing its safety guard and with a cracked table, a chainsaw, came back with a bent bar and missing chain, and an air compressor with nail gun. The tank had somehow developed a leak, and the nail gun was just gone. The total losses were climbing toward $5,000, and that wasn't counting the smaller items that had disappeared or been damaged beyond repair. I watched Tom's natural optimism and desire to help others slowly erode with each incident. He started being more hesitant about lending tools, even to longtime clients he trusted. The workshop, once a place of creativity and joy, began to feel heavy with disappointment. But we had no idea that tools were just the beginning of our problems with Kiki, or that her next move would force Tom to make a decision that would change everything. The breaking point came during a renovation project for the Hendersons, an elderly couple who'd hired Tom to modernize their kitchen while preserving its 1940s charm. Mrs. Henderson was especially anxious about the family heirlooms displayed throughout the house: photos in antique silver frames, her mother's china collection, little trinkets that meant the world to her. Tom assured her everything would be safe, just as he had with hundreds of clients before. That morning started like any other. Tom was installing new cabinets while Kiki was supposed to be carefully removing old tile backsplash. I stopped by to bring them lunch, something I often did on bigger projects. The moment I walked in, I knew something was wrong. Tom's jaw was set in that way it got when he was trying to keep his temper in check, and Kiki was nowhere to be seen. "She's in the bathroom," Tom said quietly, pulling me aside. "Been in there 20 minutes. Right after Mrs. Henderson noticed one of her silver frames was missing." My stomach dropped. We'd seen the signs: tools returning damaged, deadlines missed, excuses piling up. But theft? This was different. This wasn't just disrespect for tools. This was betraying a client's trust. Tom's reputation, built over decades of honest work, could be destroyed by something like this. Mrs. Henderson was sitting in her living room, wringing her hands, trying to convince herself she must have moved the frame herself. "It was my grandmother's wedding photo," she kept saying. "I always keep it right there, next to the china cabinet." When Kiki finally emerged, Tom didn't say a word. He just stood there, arms crossed, blocking her path to the front door. She tried to act casual, adjusting her work jacket, but I saw the slight bulge in her pocket, the way she kept her right side turned away from us. "Empty your pockets," Tom said. His voice was quiet, but it carried that weight of disappointment that's somehow worse than anger. "Now, Kiki," she tried the usual excuses. "What? I didn't take anything. How dare you accuse me?" But Tom just stood there, immovable. Finally, with trembling hands, she pulled out the silver frame. Mrs. Henderson made a small, hurt sound that I'll never forget. Tom walked Kiki to the door, his hand firmly on her shoulder. "Put it back exactly where you found it," he said. "Then get out. Don't come back to any of my job sites. Ever." That night, after spending hours reassuring Mrs. Henderson and promising to personally supervise the rest of the renovation, Tom sat in his workshop for a long time. I brought him a beer and sat with him, watching as he methodically cleaned and organized his tools, something he always did when he needed to think. "I should have seen it coming," he said finally. "The signs were all there. The damaged tools, the missing parts, the excuses. I kept giving her chances because of Ami. Because everyone deserves a shot at redemption, but some people don't want to be redeemed." The hardest part was telling Ami. She'd been my best friend for so long, and I dreaded seeing the pain this would cause her. But when we sat down with her the next day, her reaction surprised us. She started crying, but not from shock, from relief. "I didn't know how to tell you," she confessed. "She's been stealing from me too. Money from my purse, jewelry my mother left me, even my prescription medications. I've been making excuses for her for so long, trying to protect her, but maybe I've just been enabling her." The next few weeks were tense. Word got around in our small contractor community. It always does. Other business owners started sharing stories about missing tools and suspicious incidents when Kiki had been around. We discovered that she'd been pawning things, including parts from Tom's damaged tools, to support habits we hadn't known about. Tom stopped lending tools altogether after that. The workshop, once open to anyone who needed to borrow something, became a locked sanctuary. He installed better security, added cameras, and started keeping detailed records of everything that went in and out. But something else changed too. He started getting tired more easily, taking longer to recover from physical work. At first, we blamed it on stress, on the emotional toll of everything that had happened. We had no idea that these were the first signs of something much worse, something that would make Kiki's betrayal seem insignificant in comparison. It started with small things. Tom would get winded just carrying his tools up a flight of stairs. His hands would shake slightly while doing detail work. He'd come home from jobs completely exhausted, falling asleep in his workshop chair before dinner. I kept telling him to see a doctor, but you know how stubborn men can be, especially ones who've spent their whole lives being the person others rely on. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. I remember because we were supposed to be giving an estimate on a bathroom remodel that afternoon. Instead, we sat in a sterile office while a doctor explained terms like progressive and terminal and quality of life. 8 years. That's what they gave us. 8 years if we were lucky, if the treatments worked, if everything went perfectly. Tom's first question wasn't about himself. It was about his clients. "I have projects scheduled," he said, his voice steady even as his hands gripped the armrests. "People are counting on me." That was Tom, always thinking of others first. But now I had to think for both of us. We spent that night in the workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had defined our lives, making plans. Tom insisted on finishing his current projects himself. "I'm sick, not dead," he'd say whenever I tried to get him to slow down. But we both knew changes had to be made. He started training Jimmy, his newest apprentice, more intensively. Jimmy was young but reliable, reminded Tom of himself at that age. "He's got the touch," Tom would say, watching Jimmy restore an old cabinet, "knows how to listen to the wood." Over the next few months, Tom gradually handed over the more physically demanding parts of the job to Jimmy, focusing instead on the detailed finish work he loved so much. The workshop became more than just a workspace during those years. It became our sanctuary. On good days, Tom would work for hours, teaching Jimmy everything he knew about the trade. On bad days, he'd just sit in his chair, watching the dust motes dance in the sunlight streaming through the windows, telling stories about his favorite projects over the years. He started giving things away too, but in his own careful way. Mike, a contractor he'd worked with for 20 years, received his prized collection of antique wooden planes. "You're the only one who still knows how to use these properly," Tom told him. Jimmy got the newer power tools along with strict instructions about their care and maintenance. Each gift came with a story, a lesson, a piece of Tom's legacy. But some things stayed locked away. the broken tools that Kiki had returned over the years. Tom kept them as a reminder, he said, of how trust should be earned, not given. Even as his illness progressed, even as we cleaned out and reorganized the workshop to accommodate his changing needs, those damaged tools remained untouched in their corner. The years passed both too quickly and too slowly. We learned to treasure the good days and endure the bad ones. Tom continued working as long as he could, though eventually the projects became smaller, more manageable. A restored rocking chair for a new mother, a handcrafted jewelry box for a wedding gift. Each piece created with the same care and precision he'd always shown, even when his hands shook so badly he had to take breaks every few minutes. Through it all, we talked about everything: our past, our future, what would happen after. Tom was methodical about it, making sure I knew where every important document was, explaining the quirks of every tool I might need to use. He wanted no loose ends, no unfinished business, except for one thing: he never wrote a will. Everything's already where it needs to be, he'd say whenever I brought it up. The right tools are with the right people. The rest is yours. Always has been, always will be. I didn't know then how important those words would become. I was too focused on the present, on making every moment count, on memorizing the sound of his laugh echoing through the workshop, on trying to freeze time in the amber of memory. The workshop filled with more silence as the days went by, the familiar sounds of sawing and sanding gradually replaced by the whir of medical equipment we'd had to bring in. But Tom never lost his spark, his dry humor, his way of seeing the potential in things and people. The workshop stayed locked for 2 months after Tom passed. I couldn't bear to go in there. Every morning I'd make coffee and look out the kitchen window at that familiar building, remembering how the light would be on before dawn when Tom had a project he was excited about. The silence was deafening. Jimmy stopped by regularly, trying to help in his own quiet way. He'd maintain the yard, check the workshop's roof after storms, make sure nothing was deteriorating. Tom would want it taken care of. He'd say, never pushing me to go in, just keeping watch over the space that had meant so much to his mentor. Ami brought casseroles and sat with me, sharing stories about Tom from before his illness. She carefully avoided mentioning Kiki, though I could tell something was weighing on her. Later, I learned Kiki had been pressuring her mom about Tom's tools and equipment almost immediately after the funeral. Some people really have no shame. The first time I finally opened the workshop door, the smell nearly brought me to my knees. Sawdust, machine oil, and that indefinable scent that was purely Tom. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. A half-finished jewelry box on the workbench, his reading glasses perched on top of a woodworking magazine, a cup of petrified coffee by his favorite chair. I sat in that chair for hours, surrounded by the ghosts of unfinished projects and unused tools. What finally got me moving was a call from Mrs. Henderson. Her kitchen cabinet door had come loose. One of the last projects Tom had supervised before, getting too sick to work. I didn't know who else to call, she said, her voice apologetic. Tom always said if anything ever went wrong. I found myself in her kitchen that afternoon, toolbox in hand. The repair was simple, something Tom had shown me dozens of times. As I tightened the hinges, Mrs. Henderson told me about how Tom had helped her husband build their first furniture pieces when they were newlyweds. He taught Charles everything he knew about woodworking, she said, tears in her eyes. When Charles passed, Tom helped me maintain all the pieces they'd made together. That's when I realized the workshop wasn't just Tom's legacy to me. It was his gift to our entire community. Every house in town had something he'd built or fixed or restored. Every family had a story about how Tom had helped them out of a jam or taught them a valuable skill. I started going through everything systematically, organizing tools and materials just like Tom had taught me. Each drawer, each cabinet, each shelf held memories. The pegboard wall where his everyday tools hung, their outlines carefully traced in black marker. The cabinet of specialty tools, each with its own story of the unique project it was bought for. The corner shelf of books and magazines, dog-eared pages marking techniques he wanted to try. And then there were Kiki's casualties, still sitting in their corner of shame. The ruined paint sprayer, the broken table saw, the useless air compressor, thousands of dollars worth of equipment destroyed through carelessness or worse. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away yet. They represented something unfinished, a problem Tom hadn't been able to solve before he got sick. Contractors who'd worked with Tom started reaching out, offering to buy various tools they knew he'd want used properly. Each sale felt like a little memorial service, with people sharing stories about how Tom had helped them learn the trade or bail them out of difficult situations. Even the competition spoke of him with respect. Tom was tough competition, one said, but he was always fair. If he saw you needed help on a job, he'd lend a hand, no questions asked. I kept the workshop running in a limited way, mostly handling small repairs and restoration projects that I'd learned from watching Tom over the years. Jimmy took over most of the remodeling business, building his own reputation while honoring Tom's methods and standards. Regular clients still called, and it felt good to maintain those connections. But there was a shadow hovering over everything, a nagging feeling that something was unresolved. I should have known it wouldn't stay quiet forever. Kiki had been surprisingly absent since the funeral, but Ami's increasingly uncomfortable behavior at our weekly coffee dates told me something was brewing. I just didn't expect it to explode the way it did, or for Kiki to have the sheer audacity to claim what she did. It happened during what should have been a normal coffee date with Ami. We'd been doing these Saturday morning visits for decades, but lately they'd felt strained. Ami would check her phone more often, seem distracted, start sentences, and then trail off into uncomfortable silence. I knew something was eating at her, but I figured she'd tell me when she was ready. That particular morning, we were sitting on her back porch, enjoying the fall weather and catching up on neighborhood gossip, when Kiki's car pulled into the driveway. My stomach tightened immediately. I hadn't seen her since the funeral, and even then she'd kept her distance. She climbed out of her car with that familiar swagger that always set my teeth on edge. "Mom, I need to borrow," Kiki started, then pretended to notice me for the first time. "Oh, Sarah, perfect timing, actually. I've been meaning to talk to you." Ami suddenly became very interested in her coffee cup, and I knew right then that this wasn't a coincidence. Kiki had planned this, and somehow talked her mother into setting it up. I watched as she pulled up a chair, uninvited, and settled in like she owned the place. "So," she said, trying to sound casual, but with an edge in her voice I recognized from all those times she'd made excuses about Tom's broken tools. "I've been doing some thinking about Tom's workshop, the workshop. Not Tom. Not her former employer, who'd given her chances when no one else would. Not the man who'd tried to teach her a trade, the workshop, and everything in it. What about it?" I kept my voice neutral, though my hands tightened around my coffee cup. "Well, Tom promised me some things, before he got sick. We had conversations about tools he wanted me to have, equipment he said I could use for my own business someday." I felt like I'd been slapped. 2 years of watching Tom battle his illness, 8 years of intimate conversations about his wishes, countless discussions about who should get what, and never once had he mentioned leaving anything to Kiki. In fact, the only times he'd brought her up during those final years were as cautionary tales when teaching Jimmy about respecting tools and client trust. "Really?" I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "When exactly did he promise you these things?" Kiki launched into a story about helping Tom organize the workshop one day, how he'd supposedly pointed out various tools and said she could have them when the time was right. Her story had more holes than the screens she'd ruined on the Henderson project, dates that didn't match up, details about tools Tom hadn't even owned at the times she mentioned. I looked at Amy, who was still studying her coffee cup like it held the secrets of the universe. Her hands were shaking slightly, and I could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. This was killing her. Watching her daughter lie, knowing she was trying to take advantage of her best friend's grief. "Kiki," I said, still maintaining that eerie calm, "do you remember the Graco paint sprayer?" She faltered for just a moment. "What about it? Do you remember borrowing it? Brand new, $100 to $200 sprayer. Do you remember how you returned it? That wasn't my fault. It was defective or something. And the table saw, the air compressor, the chainsaw, were they all defective too?" Kiki's face hardened. "That's different. This is about what Tom promised me. I deserve something for all the work I did for him." I almost laughed. "All the work? You mean before or after he caught you stealing from the Hendersons? Before or after you cost him thousands in damaged equipment? He forgave me for that." Kiki's voice rose. "We worked it out. He understood I was going through a rough time." That's when Ami finally spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "No, honey, he didn't forgive you. He fired you. He never trusted you." Again, I knew about it. Everyone knew about it. "You need to stop this." The look Kiki gave her mother could have curdled milk. "You're taking her side? After everything? There are no sides here," I said, standing up. "There's just the truth. Tom left no will because he didn't need to. Everything was already arranged before he died. He gave away what he wanted to give. Away. The rest is mine." End of story. Kiki's face went through a series of emotions. Anger, calculation, then something that looked almost like triumph. "No will? Well, that changes things, doesn't it? I should look into my legal rights here. After all, verbal promises count for something." As she stormed off to her car, I saw Ami deflate in her chair. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have warned you she was planning this. She's been talking about it for weeks, getting more and more worked up about her inheritance. I didn't know how to tell you." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "It's not your fault, but we need to talk about what happens next." After Kiki's dramatic exit, Ami and I spent hours talking, really talking, the way we hadn't since before Tom got sick. She told me how Kiki had been pressing her for information about Tom's tools and equipment, trying to get her to remember conversations that never happened, how she'd catch Kiki driving by the workshop late at night, like she was casing the place, how she'd found printouts about inheritance law in Kiki's apartment when she was helping her move some furniture. "She's desperate," Amy explained, pouring us both another coffee. The contracting company she was working for fired her last month. Tools kept disappearing from job sites. She's burning through her savings, and she's got this idea that Tom's equipment could be her ticket to starting her own business. I called Lisa, my friend who practices family law, that afternoon. We met for lunch the next day, and I brought all the documentation I could find. Property records, marriage certificate, receipts for major tool purchases, everything. Lisa listened to the whole story, occasionally making notes, her face growing increasingly amused. "Let me get this straight," she said, tapping her pen against her legal pad. "There's no will. You live in a community property state. You were married for over 20 years. And this woman who your husband fired for theft thinks she has a claim to his professional equipment based on alleged verbal promises she can't prove." When she put it that way, it did sound ridiculous. Lisa explained that in our state, without a will, all community property automatically passes to the surviving spouse. Given that Tom and I had been married for so long, virtually everything was community property by default. Even if there had been some verbal promise, Lisa said, which I seriously doubt given what you've told me about Tom's character and his history with this woman, it wouldn't matter. He couldn't have legally promised away community property without your consent. And from what you've said, you never consented to anything. She helped me draft a formal letter stating my ownership rights and warning against any attempts to claim or remove property from the workshop. "We probably won't need this," she said, "but better to have it ready." Word about Kiki's claim spread through the contractor community like wildfire. Jimmy was the first to show up at the workshop, concern written all over his face. "She's been asking around," he told me, "trying to find anyone who might back up her story about Tom promising her tools. Nobody's buying it, but she's persistent." Other contractors started dropping by too, each with their own Kiki story. Mike, who'd received Tom's antique planes, told me about catching her trying to sell stolen tools at a flea market years ago. Another remembered her attempting to pass off damaged rental equipment as having been broken by the next customer. Each story confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't about any promised inheritance. This was about opportunity and entitlement. The support from the community meant everything. Mrs. Henderson brought me lunch one day and sat with me in the workshop, talking about how Tom had helped her daughter learn basic home repairs after her divorce. "He believed in teaching people to be self-sufficient," she said, looking around at all the tools. "But he also believed in earning trust. These tools weren't just things to him, they were a responsibility." That gave me an idea. I spent an evening in the workshop looking at all the broken tools in their corner. Each one represented a betrayal of trust, a lesson Tom had learned the hard way about Kiki's character. They were taking up space, almost 35 square feet of valuable storage, and serving no purpose except as painful reminders. Or were they? I called Ami that night. "Remember how Tom always said tools should be with people who'd use them properly?" "Of course," she said cautiously. "Well, I've been thinking about Kiki's inheritance claim. Maybe she's right. Maybe she should have. Something to remember Tom by. Something that represents their true relationship." There was a long pause before Ami spoke. "Sarah, what are you planning?" I looked at the pile of broken tools, remembering each excuse, each lie, each moment of disrespect. "I'm planning to give Kiki exactly what she deserves, and I'm going to need your help to deliver it." That's when I outlined my plan, a plan that would not only solve my storage problem, but also teach Kiki a lesson about the true meaning of inheritance. As I explained the details, Ami's initial hesitation turned to understanding, then to something approaching satisfaction. After all, what better inheritance could there be than receiving back the very tools you'd disrespected, along with the responsibility you'd always avoided? The next morning, I started cataloging every broken tool Kiki had returned over the years. Each item told its own story of disrespect and carelessness. The Graco paint sprayer, its nozzle mangled beyond recognition, motor seized from improper cleaning. The table saw with its missing safety guard and cracked table, a lawsuit waiting to happen if anyone tried using it. The chainsaw with its bent bar and missing chain, probably sold for quick cash. The air compressor with its mysterious leak, and the nail gun that had mysteriously vanished. I laid everything out on Tom's main workbench, creating a display of destruction that would have broken his heart all over again. Each piece represented not just monetary loss, but a violation of the basic principles Tom lived by: respect for tools, responsibility for borrowed items, honest work for honest pay. Jimmy stopped by while I was organizing and just stood there, shaking his head at the collection. "I remember when some of these were new," he said, picking up the rusted channel locks. "Tom used to say these were the best he'd ever owned. Lasted 20 years before she got her hands on them. I had Ami come over to help document everything. We took photos, found old receipts, and made notes about when each item was borrowed and returned. The total value of damaged and destroyed equipment came to just over $5,000, not counting the countless smaller tools that had simply disappeared over time." "Are you sure about this?" Ami asked as we boxed everything up. "She's going to be furious." "Good," I said, carefully wrapping the broken CD player in bubble wrap. a final touch of irony. She should be furious. She should feel exactly how Tom felt every time she brought back something she'd destroyed. We decided to deliver everything the next morning. I wanted to do it early, before Kiki had a chance to start her day or come up with more schemes about her supposed inheritance. Ami agreed to help, though I could tell she was nervous about her daughter's reaction. The next morning dawned clear and cool. I borrowed Jimmy's truck since we needed the space for all the broken equipment. Ami met me at my house at 7 a.m. and we loaded everything up. Each box was carefully labeled with the date the item was borrowed and the date it was returned, along with its original purchase price. "She's usually still asleep at this hour," Ami said as we pulled up to Kiki's apartment complex. "She works evening shifts at the bar now." Perfect. I wanted this delivered like a surprise gift. Something she'd discover when she woke up, just like how she used to surprise Tom with newly broken tools. We carried the boxes up to her second-floor apartment, stacking them neatly by her door. I could have just dumped them, but that wouldn't have been Tom's way. Even in revenge, there should be order and purpose. The final touch was an envelope taped to the top box. Inside was the letter Lisa had helped me draft, officially stating my ownership of all Tom's remaining tools and equipment, along with a simple note: "Here's your inheritance. Every tool you borrowed from Tom returned exactly as you left them. Consider this matter settled." Just as we finished arranging everything, we heard movement inside the apartment. Ami and I quickly moved down the hallway, but stayed within sight. I wanted to see this. The door opened and Kiki appeared, still in her pajamas, probably investigating the noise. Her expression shifted from confusion to recognition to anger as she took in the pile of boxes. She snatched the envelope, tore it open, and started reading. Her face went red, then white, then red again. "What the hell is this?" she shouted into the hallway. "You can't just dump this junk here." I stepped back into view, Ami right beside me. "Actually, I can. It's your property now. Everything you borrowed and broke over the years. I'm just returning it to its rightful owner. These aren't even worth anything anymore. They're all broken." "Exactly," I said, keeping my voice level. "They're in exactly the same condition you left them in. I thought you'd want them since you were so interested in Tom's tools. These are the ones you actually used." She looked at the boxes, then at her mother, clearly hoping for support. But Ami stood firm beside me. "You broke them, honey. You never took responsibility. Well, now they're your responsibility." Kiki's face twisted with rage. "This is harassment. You can't make me take these." "Oh, but I can. You see, I have documentation of you borrowing each and every item. They're legally your property now. Abandoned property to be specific, since you never properly returned them in working condition. I'm just delivering them to their rightful owner." The look on her face was worth every second of planning. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the best revenge is just giving someone exactly what they claimed they wanted all along. Kiki's meltdown in the hallway was spectacular. She threatened to call the police, then lawyers, then finally resorted to screaming about how we were all against her. The neighbors started poking their heads out, and I could see them filming on their phones, because of course they were. In the end, she stormed back into her apartment and slammed the door, leaving all the boxes in the hallway. "She can't just leave them here," one of her neighbors said. "It's blocking the fire exit." "You're right," I replied, loud enough to be heard through her door. "That would be a violation of building code. I'm sure Kiki knows that, since she claims to know so much about construction and tools." 15 minutes later, after much swearing and door slamming, every box was dragged into her apartment. Mission accomplished, and I had reclaimed 35 square feet of valuable storage space in my workshop. The aftermath was both exactly what I expected and surprisingly positive. Kiki tried posting angry rants on social media about how I dumped garbage at her home, but they backfired when contractors who knew the whole story started commenting with their own experiences of her borrowing and breaking their equipment. Each post just spread the story further through the community, serving as a warning to anyone who might consider lending her tools in the future. The best part? She tried selling some of the broken tools online, claiming they just needed minor repairs. Several contractors I knew made lowball offers just to mess with her, each one pointing out every flaw she'd caused. "Wasn't this the same paint sprayer you borrowed from Tom 3 years ago?" one commented. "I remember when it was new. Ami and I had some healing to do after everything. We spent a long evening talking about Kiki, about enabling behavior, about the difference between helping someone and letting them avoid consequences. It wasn't easy for her to stand with me that day, but it was necessary. For all of us. Tom would have loved this," she said, laughing through tears. "He always said tools had a way of teaching people lessons about themselves. The workshop feels different now, lighter somehow. I've rearranged things, making the space my own while keeping the essence of what Tom created. Jimmy still comes by regularly, and we've started offering basic home repair classes for people in the community. Last week, we taught a group of single moms how to fix leaky faucets and patch drywall, the kind of practical knowledge Tom always believed everyone should have. Mrs. Henderson's daughter now brings her kids by on weekends, and I'm teaching them the basics of woodworking using some of Tom's beginner's tools. They're learning the same lessons he taught everyone. Respect your tools, clean up after yourself, take responsibility for your mistakes. The youngest girl reminds me of Tom sometimes, with her careful attention to detail and her absolute delight when she gets something right. I keep Lisa's letter framed on the workshop wall now, right next to Tom's first contractor's license. It's a reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself means being clever rather than confrontational. The space where Kiki's broken tools used to sit is now a new workbench where I teach kids about proper tool maintenance. There's a certain poetry to that transformation. Last month, I heard through the contractor grapevine that Kiki had tried applying for a job with a construction company 2 towns over. The owner called me, asking about her experience with Tom. I told him the truth, all of it. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone's actions speak for themselves. The workshop is alive again, filled with the sounds of learning and creation rather than the weight of broken promises. Tom's legacy continues, not through the tools themselves, but through the lessons they help teach. Every time I hear the familiar whir of a saw or smell fresh sawdust in the air, I can almost hear him saying, "Tools are just teachers in disguise. The real lesson is in how you treat them and each other." As for Kiki's inheritance, last I heard, those boxes of broken tools are still sitting in her apartment. A permanent reminder that what you put out into the world has a way of coming back to you. Sometimes it comes back in a neat stack of boxes, delivered at 7 a.m. with a note explaining exactly why you deserve every broken piece. The workshop doors are open again, just like Tom always kept them. But now there's a new sign hanging next to them, one that makes me smile every time I see it. Tools and trust, both, must be earned. It's amazing how much lighter life feels when you finally clean out the broken things and make room for what matters.